Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope to be able to actually live up to it and that you still feel the same way towards the end. And actually, the person who ran the teaching fellowship that was just mentioned now works for Wayne State. And so Matt Boulay has been wonderful enough to sort of walk me around campus today. I also had a Pumshki, and as I've told people, no one outside of Detroit cares anything about Pumshki. So I'm so happy that I've been here on Fat Tuesday, and so I think it's going to be a good day. And so I'm going to be talking about my book, and the part of the book that I'm going to talk about or use to motivate today's work is the dilemma that I think is really interesting. And so the first dilemma about the role of black colleges for black Americans, just a few statistics about them that sort of demonstrate their importance to black higher education. In today's point in time, when black colleges only account for 3% of all colleges and universities nationwide, they continue to account for 20% of all bachelor degrees that are awarded to black Americans, 25% of all bachelor degrees that are specialized in science, technology, engineering, and management. And at the same time, they cost half of what the average traditionally white, or as many people think of them being mainstream, four-year colleges. And so while we have this information about the role that black colleges play in the educational livelihood of black Americans, we also have a very different narrative about the perception of black colleges. And so a quick search online about black colleges will typically yield various articles that are actually calling into question whether or not black colleges are actually needed. And so the primary cultural narrative that we have about black colleges is actually, do we still need HBCUs? In this day and age when we're supposed to be pushing towards integrated higher education, what's the role of a group of schools that continues to maintain a missionary focus on the education of black Americans? And so the thing that I've been interested in is sort of understanding this dilemma. How can we understand that if you look at the statistics, black colleges clearly play a key role in the production of highly educated African Americans, yet at the same time, many people wonder if we even still need these schools. And so throughout my graduate studies especially, one of the things that I was interested in was thinking about this process of how race affects organizations and the organizing process. And so one of the conclusions that I've come to is that you sort of can't understand how on the one hand we could have such demonstrable statistics about the role that black colleges play in black higher education, and yet have this narrative that situates them by and large as a problem to be dealt with, without understanding how race impacts organizations. And when scholars typically approach the study of race in organizations, they do so at an individual level. And so a classic study might focus on, say, why an equally qualified black person doesn't get selected for an interview in comparison to a similarly qualified white person, or why once within an organization, an equally qualified black person doesn't get the same opportunities for promotion or pay and other things as a similarly qualified white person. But what I've been interested in is understanding how those same legal policies and social customs that lead black Americans as individuals to be disadvantaged in particular contexts, how does that actually affect organizations that are focused on providing black Americans with educational opportunities? How do legal policies and social customs around race affect organizations who maintain a mission to help black Americans receive education? And the particular parts that I'm interested in is how do those social policies and customs affect those organizations' ability to promote their rights, in the case of black colleges and universities, their right to actually exist? And how does those policies affect those organizations' ability to acquire resources? And so in thinking about black colleges, how does race and our social policies and customs regarding race affect their ability to acquire resources like prestige? If you think about, again, the role that they play in black higher education, they should be viewed far more prestigiously than they actually are. And so in thinking about this idea about how race affects organizations, American higher education turns out to be a very good empirical setting in which to understand this problem. And so within American higher education, there was an institutional logic or a fundamental belief or practice that American higher education should actually be separated along the lines of race for much of its history. Really up until the late 1970s, this logic or practice of separateness guided American higher education. And so you had colleges that educated white Americans solely, and then you also had colleges that solely educated black Americans. And so traditionally white colleges, in terms of their practices and policies, they had explicit practices that were written into their mission statements, into their admission policies, that they were supposed to deny black students admission. Alternatively, you also had historically black colleges, again, that educated black students, but most black colleges actually did not have explicit policies that said they were going to deny white students admission. That was just social custom, particularly because the majority of black colleges, all but 3, are located in the former slaveholding states. And so there were actually some instances when white faculty who were working at historically black colleges wanted their kids to go to the college that they worked for. However, some local authority would find out, raise a stink, and the white faculty member would have to remove their child from that campus. And so though black colleges had no specific policies about denying white students admission by and large, you still ended up with a scenario where black colleges did not have white students on their campus. So for most of our history, our educational history, you had very separate worlds. You have the historically black college world and the traditionally white college world. And so I'm going to be focused mostly on black colleges today, and so I'll just talk a little bit more about the world of black colleges. And so again, if we think about historically, black colleges were established to educate black students. White students were not allowed to attend these schools. And so we can think about black colleges having been established as racially conscious institutions. They're racially conscious of the fact that the student who's going to be attending their school is a black student. The student who's going to be attending their school is a descendant of ex-slaves and freedmen. And so the first black college emerges in 1854 in a border state. And so slightly before the Civil War the outbreak of the Civil War, we see our first black college emerging, and it's educating people who have either escaped slavery or people who've been born free. And so in terms of what the colleges look like, they have all the diversity that we tend to associate with American colleges and universities. And so throughout history, there have been 154 historically black colleges and universities. Some of them are 4-year colleges. Others have grown to become graduate institutions. Some of them are professional schools, so they just focus on medicine or they just focus on divinity. Some of them are privately operated. The majority of the privately operated schools have a missionary body that's associated with them, so they have some religious imperative that's associated with them. And there are also about half of the schools that are publicly or state controlled. And so again, we have all the diversity within black colleges that we tend to associate with traditionally white colleges as well. And so thinking about other actors who are important within the livelihood of black colleges or within the organizational development of black colleges, and also thinking about how these other actors also recognize the role of race within higher education. So the missionary societies that founded and supported many black colleges oftentimes already had traditionally white colleges that were in existence before 1854. But again, recognizing that it was taboo to educate, taboo in certain contexts, but also illegal in other contexts to educate both black and white students together, the missionary societies established separate schools for blacks. So they didn't think about integrating the white colleges that were already in existence. They adopted this racially conscious focus. Foundations were similar as well, and so foundations had granting programs that traditionally white colleges could apply to, and separate granting programs that historically black colleges could apply to and receive funding through. And so again, thinking about each of these organizations that's interacting with black colleges has a specific racial narrative in which they interact with black colleges. But then we can also think about all the other constituents that interact with colleges as well. We can think about students who, again, had a very clear understanding. If I'm black, I need to apply to the historically black college because by and large, traditionally white colleges are not accepting me. Also faculty, being clear in their choices about where to work and what those choices were gonna mean, as well as communities where these schools are residing. And so for today's talk, the group of organizations, the group of organizations that are going to end up meaning the most to me are actually going to be the colleges and their relationship. It's showing up on my computer, not here. So there should be two other circles that has the federal government and then another circle that has the southern states. And so I'm going to be mostly concentrating on the relationship between the colleges themselves, the federal government, especially as we think about the judicial branch of the federal government, so the Supreme Court, and then thinking about the southern states. And so although there are, a collection of states that had slavery as a practice, I actually think of them as one state because by and large they adopted a very similar framework for how they approached black colleges when they started in 1854, and that actually carried through to the time period that I'm going to be focused on throughout this talk. Oh, it actually does show up now. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be focused on the colleges, the federal government, and the former slaveholding states or the southern state. And so, again, in thinking about that dilemma that I posed to you in terms of, on the one hand, we know that black colleges play an incredibly vital role in the education of black Americans, even to this day. But on the other hand, we have these constant calls in terms of the questioning or the necessity of black colleges, and thinking about how we got there. How did we get in this scenario? The place that we have to start and where we have to look to understand this sort of duality about how black colleges are understood is to focus on how the shift from race conscious to race neutral, or another way to think about the ways in which people talk about race neutral policy is colorblind educational policy affected black colleges. And so if we want to understand how we have this dual way of understanding them as being incredibly important for the education of black Americans, but at the same time we can call into question their necessity, this is the point that we have to focus on, the point in the mid-20th century where we shift from having truly separate worlds of higher education, where we have historically black colleges and traditionally white colleges, to the point at which we began to think about we need to create these integrated spaces of learning. And what I'm going to argue is that the outcome that we're left with, where we begin to question historically black colleges, question their necessity, question their relevance, actually was not inevitable. That we need to understand the various agendas that actors within the world of higher education had in order to understand how things worked out the way that they did. And so before moving directly into the middle of the 20th century, I'm going to start a little bit before World War II to think about the point at which this separate world of higher education began to break down somewhat. And so we first see the beginning of the erosion of this idea that we're going to have these truly racially distinct realms of higher education, that we're going to have traditionally white and historically black colleges begin to occur at the graduate level of higher education, slightly before World War II in the 1930s. And so during this point in time, it was very important, a part of this racial logic of separateness was the idea that if you were not going to allow black students to attend traditionally white colleges, you had to offer them equal educational opportunities elsewhere. And this was at the college level and at the graduate level at historically black colleges. And so during the 1930s, at the graduate level especially, it was quite easy to demonstrate that black students did not have equal educational opportunities at historically black colleges. Those historically black colleges that offered graduate programs were few and far in between, and the graduate programs that they had were quite limited, oftentimes to mostly education or divinity. And so during this time period, the NAACP begins to file a series of lawsuits in the 1920s and the 1930s. And these lawsuits actually began to meet with some success because it's very easy for them to demonstrate through the court system that the states are actually not providing black students with equal educational opportunities at the graduate level. They can very easily look at the curriculum that the average black college is offering and demonstrate to the courts that black students do not have the same opportunities as similarly situated white students. And so in 1936, we see the University of Maryland admit its first black law student. A few years later, we see that the policy that denies black students admission at the University of Texas's law school is challenged by the NAACP. And we also see in Oklahoma that the doctoral program in education at traditionally white University of Oklahoma, they also have to grapple with, are we going to have to admit a black student? Because the NAACP has clearly shown that black students don't have access to doctoral programs in education at the historically black colleges that are located in Oklahoma. And so even by the 1930s, we begin to see that there are some black students who are actually attending graduate programs at traditionally white colleges. Because again, states have to prove that they're offering graduate students who of color similar opportunities. But the real cracks in this bifurcated system or in this separate system happened with the 1954 ruling in Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas. And so with this ruling, it became illegal for states to continue to segregate their educational systems on the basis of race. And so the Supreme Court in this ruling, argues that it's inherently unequal to actually maintain this practice, and that the unequalness of this situation falls primarily on black students, that they're the ones who feel the brunt of this inequity. And so what I want to do, though, is focus on what the original goal of Brown actually was, because this is important when we begin to think about how Brown was actually then later interpreted and applied and the consequences of these later interpretations for historically black colleges. And so the initial focus of Brown was actually to guarantee an individual's right to attend any school of their choosing. And so when Brown was initially passed, and the way in which the NAACP argued for Brown was that they focused on how the unconstitutionality of the state making it, of the state's role in making it so that African Americans could not attend any school that they wanted to attend. And so that was the focus on Brown, protecting an individual's freedom of choice, freedom to choose a school that was traditionally white or to choose a school that was historically black. But obviously the freedom to choose a school, most importantly, that has been historically traditionally white. And so with that in mind, the initial focus in terms of how do you actually apply Brown to higher education was all about ensuring that traditionally white colleges no longer prohibited black students from attending. And so the initial focus was all about making sure that traditionally white colleges, particularly those within the South, removed the discriminatory practices that were inherent to their admission policies. And so again, most of these schools within their mission statements, within their admission policy, specifically said, we do not admit black students. This is a school for white students. And so the initial focus was on getting those things removed and getting traditionally white colleges to think about the policies and practices that they had in place that made it difficult or prohibited blacks outright from attending. Alternatively, again, black colleges, when Brown is passed, they didn't actually actively prevent white students from attending. And at this time, the only evidence that higher education had actually began to desegregate was actually at black colleges. And so black colleges, particularly those located in in or near border states. So take black colleges in West Virginia. By the mid-1960s, they had actually effectively desegregated. Their students' bodies were pretty much 50% black, 50% white. And this was because there are many whites who, not just white students, most students prefer to attend colleges that are close to their home. And where the black colleges in West Virginia were located were actually quite close to white communities. And so once Brown versus the board passes, white students in West Virginia, they're happy to attend the black colleges that are near them because that means they can stay home. They don't have to go far from home in order to attend these schools. And so if there was any evidence at this time that higher education was actually going to desegregate, you found that on the campuses of black colleges, again, who had never erected policies that specifically prohibited white students from attending. And so again, the initial focus in Brown is to make sure that traditionally white colleges stop preventing black students from attending. However, as Brown was actually applied, this is when we began to see the first narratives about, do we actually still need historically black colleges and universities? Are black colleges actually still necessary? And the way in which black colleges began to be discussed within this time, especially within legal circles, is, are black colleges actually an obstacle to racially integrating higher education? And so again, what I argue is that it's actually not clear that this way of thinking about black colleges, this way of thinking about the role of black colleges post-Brown was actually inevitable. And so in order to understand how this way of thinking about black colleges emerges, we actually need to go back through and question things quite a bit. And so what begins, or the type of logic or the type of narrative that begins to unfold at this particular period in time, is this idea of creating a race-neutral version of American higher education. And so this idea that, historically what we've had again are these very separate spheres where we have traditionally white colleges that again prohibit blacks from attending, and we have historically black colleges that don't have any specific policies, but by social custom, white students don't attend them. We want to get rid of this way of thinking about American higher education altogether and create this situation where what we end up with is just colleges. This idea that colleges should actually not be racially identifiable by the type of students who actually attend these schools. This is a sort of narrative or logic that begins to take shape and take hold, where what we want is just colleges. We don't want to think about them as being traditionally white or historically black. They just need to be these sort of racially non-specific entities that everyone actually has access to. But again, it's important to think about this race-neutral logic is actually not inevitable. Things didn't have to work out this way. And so what I look at and argue about within the book is how this race-neutral logic occurs as a result of a lot of institutional work, a lot of work by the actors who were invested in American higher education at this point in time. And so when sociologists talk about this notion of institutional work, what they're focused on is this idea about how the people who are invested in a given institution, so the people and groups who are invested in American higher education, how they work to shape scenarios and dynamics so that they will turn out in their favor. And so, we could think about the same way that we sort of think about how political action committees within the political arena, we have this notion that they're working to shape things in their favor. They're putting money behind certain candidates because they want certain legislation to be passed, or they don't want this other legislation to be passed. They want to block that. And so sociologists are quite interested in that in other realms outside of politics, this idea that certain people are going to get behind certain platforms and push them because that's the outcome that they want. And so we think about this work as being creative. You have to have a lot of knowledge about the institution that you're hoping to shape. So again, if it's politics, you have to have a lot of knowledge about, say, how Congress works, a lot of knowledge about, which politicians will get behind your arguments, which politicians to back, which not to back, that sort of thing. And so the same thing is happening here, that the people who are invested in making this race-neutral way of understanding higher education come about, they need to have a lot of knowledge and creativity in terms of which people they need to motivate, which people they need to persuade, and which people they need to sway within American higher education to make this way of thinking about colleges actually come about. But it's also important to think about there are winners and losers in this process. That historically black colleges had a narrative that they wanted to come forward, but that narrative didn't actually come forward. Instead, this narrative of race neutrality or racially non-specific entities came forward. And so although you can be both creative and knowledgeable, the outcome that you want may not actually occur. And so what we ended up having within American higher education was that there were multiple groups working towards advancing different narratives about the role of colleges. Could they continue to be racially specific, or did they have to become these just colleges, these entities that are racially non-identifiable? And at this point in time, lawsuits become a place in which you can easily witness these different narratives emerging and easily witness who's winning and losing in these scenarios as well. And so I'll just talk about one lawsuit in particular. And so this is the Adams versus Richardson lawsuit. The NAACP continues to play an active role. You know, after Brown, they didn't just like drop off the scene. They continue to play an active role in making sure that Brown was actually implemented and that higher education at all levels, higher education desegregation would actually come about. And so in 1970, the NAACP files a lawsuit, their legal defense fund files a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This is one of the precursors to the U.S. Department of Education. And so they file a lawsuit. They say there are three things that they raise within this lawsuit, among others, but these are sort of the three most important things. The NAACP points out it's more than 10 years since Brown. There is ample evidence to indicate that within the American South, we still have these racially distinct spheres. We still have the world of traditionally white colleges and historically black colleges, even though we're supposed to be eroding those differences. They argue that this, obviously violates Supreme Court rulings, not just Brown at this point, but a series of other smaller rulings that had stipulated that, yes, states do actually have to do something about integrating school systems. But they also point out, the NAACP also points out something that most people had sort of overlooked up until this point in time, that the 1964 Civil Rights Act stipulated that states that continue to violate integration orders, or states that sort of drag their feet on integrating their school systems at all levels, are actually supposed to lose access to federal funding. And so if you think about all the funding that states give to schools, not just states giving to publicly controlled schools, but also if you think about if I'm a researcher at a private college and I have an NIH or NSF grant, that's also federal money. And so if you think about all the monies that the federal government gives to schools, those schools that were actually dragging their feet on integrating were actually supposed to lose access to that funding. And so the NAACP lays these claims at the government's feet. And so in the course of this lawsuit working its way to the Supreme Court, what we see is that actors end up using institutional work to actually advance a vision of what are the true impediments to actually racially integrating Southern higher education. And so black colleges have to, tell the Supreme Court, tell district courts, tell lower courts what prevents their schools from racially integrating. So why is it that black colleges haven't become just colleges? But at the same time, the southern states that operate traditionally white colleges and universities also had to provide a narrative about what prevents traditionally white colleges from becoming just colleges. Why have they not been successful in recruiting and retaining black students? And so, again, even at the point that the Adams lawsuit is filed in 1970, to the extent that black colleges have been brought into this conversation is almost a win in some regard. Because again, when Brown was first filed, it was all about making sure that traditionally white colleges integrated their campuses. black colleges were never really on the table because they never actively prevented white students from attending their schools. And so to the extent that black colleges had to even respond to these allegations, it's sort of a win for those who were starting to believe that black colleges were a problem, that black colleges prevented the integration of American higher education. That being said, both parties developed narratives about what really represents an impediment to racially integrating American higher education. All right. For black colleges, they argued a few things. When their advocates through the amicus brief process said what really impedes racial integration, what prevents us from actively recruiting and retaining white students are a few things. And these few things are created by southern states. So what prevents black colleges from racially integrating? It's the southern states and the actions that they undertake. And so one of the things that black colleges and their advocates pointed towards were these historical funding discrepancies that existed between state-controlled black colleges or public black colleges and state-controlled traditionally white colleges. And so states had long diverted money that was meant for historically black colleges to their traditionally white colleges. And so what this resulted in were these discrepancies where in like 1970s time, the average traditionally white college in a state like Mississippi is receiving $38 million in state appropriations annually, whereas the average black college receives less than $20 million annually in the state of Mississippi, as an example. And so what this means is that black colleges don't have the same level of facilities, they can't pay their faculty as much, they don't have, say, the same number of extracurricular offerings. And so if you take a black student and a white student who's comparing if you take a white student who's comparing college choices and they're comparing a black college and a white college, the black college just doesn't look as good in comparison to the white colleges because of these funding discrepancies. And so the other thing that they argue is that traditionally white colleges and the southern states keep opening up these satellite campuses of, say, again, using Mississippi as an example, of the University of Mississippi next door to the historically black college. These satellite campuses are newer, they have more funds because, again, you keep diverting funds that are meant for black colleges to these traditionally white colleges. And so here again, even though the historically black college had long been situated in a scenario where they actually, could have drawn white students from their community, the state keeps opening up these annex branches of traditionally white colleges near us. And so that's a problem. And so black colleges work towards advancing this logic or narrative that's essentially racially conscious. It's talking about the specific ways in which states disadvantage black colleges in favor of traditionally white colleges. This narrative that they develop is reparatory in nature, and so it sounds quite similar if you think about how individual black Americans have argued for racial reparations. They're arguing that their organizations need to be repaired using a racial framework and a logic, and that this racial reparations really needs to focus on upgrading the colleges. And so that's the vision that black colleges have, that we'll continue to have a racially conscious way to think about American higher education going forward. Alternatively, the southern state offers a very different logic. What the southern state suggests through this amicus brief process, as this Adams case is working its way through the court, is that what impedes racial integration is black colleges. As long as black colleges exist, black students will continue to make the wrong choice. And so interestingly enough, the southern states actually recognized that they had long underfunded black colleges, but they used that same information in their amicus brief process to argue, look, you can see traditionally white colleges have better facilities, but black students keep choosing to go to these poorly funded institutions. And so they are making the wrong choice. And so how can we get them to stop making the wrong choice? You have to get rid of black colleges in order for that to actually happen. And so the southern state argues for two things. They argue that, again, the way in which to integrate colleges, integrate traditionally white spaces, is to close or merge black colleges. So you close the black colleges, that will then force black students to choose traditionally white colleges. Or you merge a historically black college with a traditionally white college. That will make the traditionally white college diverse because now it will also have these black students there. They also argue that, again, this racially repertory logic, they argue that that is racist in and of itself. And aren't we supposed to be beyond this time where we have these racially specific and racially conscious solutions to higher education? And so they argue that, yes, we underfunded the schools, but that's in the past. And to actually correct for those past discrepancies will force us to continue organizing our conversations around race, racial disparities, and racial differences. And didn't the Brown ruling say that that was a problem, that the state is actually not supposed to be focused on race when we're talking about education? And so this narrative about closing colleges, or this idea that compensating or focusing on racial reparations actually becomes seen as a race-neutral way to think about higher education. We're not going to talk about race, and so isn't that then a racially neutral framework? And so obviously though, it doesn't take much to see how this logic of race neutrality obviously consistently disadvantages black colleges. And so again, the tenets of the race neutral perspective were don't compensate black colleges for past funding discrepancies, and close or merge black colleges so that traditionally white colleges can become diverse in all these particular ways. But what is also important to think about in the historical arc is that this race neutral logic basically allowed the state to basically just rebrand its long-held antipathy towards black colleges. And so when we think about the history of Southern state authorities in black higher education, it's not a very positive history from that regard. And so again, after the Civil War, states in the South already had colleges, but they very quickly decided that they were not going to allow black students to attend those colleges. And so to some extent, especially state-controlled historically black colleges exist because state legislatures had to create this alternative educational space for blacks because they refused to admit them to the white spaces that already existed. And so in some ways, this now logic that's been branded as race neutral simply allows the state to continue its hostile stance towards the higher education of blacks altogether. In the pre-Brown period, the way in which this hostility played out was again to underfund the black colleges so that they couldn't upgrade their facilities and have sort of state-of-the-art educational technologies going on. But now what we see in this post-Brown period is that the same sort of tactics that disadvantage colleges are now rebranded as being a race-neutral way to think about higher education altogether. And to the extent that the Supreme Court sides with the Southern states argument as the Adams case and its other cases worked its way up to the Supreme Court, they basically endorse this race-neutral way of thinking about higher education, despite the fact that, again, it clearly disadvantages black colleges. The Supreme Court, in its ruling, in the Adams case and in other cases, agrees with the Southern states argument and says, yes, addressing past funding discrepancies actually advances a Jim Crow style of thinking, that we are supposed to be moving beyond this way of thinking about we need to racially repair people and organizations. That as long as we focus on race, we won't actually move to this phase where colleges are just college. So they endorse that logic, that way of thinking. They also, again, in endorsing this perspective, essentially move the behavior again further off of what traditionally white colleges were doing. And so in endorsing this perspective that black colleges are essentially the problem, and as long as black colleges exist, then black students won't choose traditionally white colleges, it actually moves the focus off of traditionally white colleges and what their admission policies are. Have they actually done all to create, new and updated admission policies that wouldn't actually disadvantage black students. There was hardly any attention paid to what the southern states and their colleges were actually doing in order to recruit black students at this time. And then interestingly enough, the Supreme Court almost went one step further than the southern states even asked them to do. The Supreme Court actually decided during the Adams case and during a few others that state and federal money should actually be withheld from historically black colleges until white enrollment on their campuses increased. There was no corollary policy done for traditionally white colleges. There was no policy that said until black enrollment on traditionally white colleges reaches a certain threshold that money should be withheld from them. This policy was only levied upon historically black colleges. And so again, in thinking about the Supreme Court as being the judicial arm of the federal government, we can see here how even the federal government sort of embraced this narrative that severely disadvantaged black colleges. And so I'm thinking about this process altogether. Again, the consequences for black colleges. And so this race-neutral logic, even though, again, people think of it as being neutral because isn't the goal to get all colleges to be just colleges, but it clearly advantages traditionally white colleges. And so can we actually think about this being a race-neutral educational policy? Again, the emphasis on the behaviors of traditionally white colleges and whether or not they were actually doing all that they could to become just colleges on their own in terms of their admission policies all but disappears. But this is actually the moment when we see black colleges become labeled as a problem. This is the moment as these cases were working their way through the court system that we began to see newspaper articles appear about, are historically black colleges and universities still relevant? This is the moment when people begin to wonder, as long as historically black colleges and universities exist, will we ever have real integration? As though the presence of historically black colleges and universities is the only marker of a racially integrated system of higher education, as if there are no other ways to identify if colleges are integrated or not. And so in some sense, during this time period when this narrative about black colleges being problematic emerges, we can really see that from a historical standpoint, black colleges actually become stigmatized in a way that they weren't in the pre-Brown period. In pre-Brown period, even at the moments when the South was most vigorous in its attempts to sort of deny funding and subvert funding away from black colleges, Southern state educational authorities never suggested that what we need to do is get rid of black colleges, because they couldn't do that. They could not get rid of black colleges and insist that black and white students had equal educational opportunities. Yet here in this time period from the late 20th century going forward, Southern states could simultaneously insist that we get rid of black colleges without doing equal work to make sure that black students actually had spaces on campuses that were traditionally or historically white. And so thinking about this idea that on the one hand we can get rid of black colleges without ensuring that the students who attend black colleges actually have educational opportunities or access to educational opportunities on traditionally white college campuses, you can do both of those things at the same time now, whereas you could have never done that in the pre-Brown period. So thinking about this moment as being very critical for black colleges, it's the moment in which they become labeled as a problem and become stigmatized in a way such that allows people to openly question their necessity despite the role that they play in the education of black Americans, and openly question their necessity despite the evidence that suggests that, particularly within the South, there is no space for these students that attend historically black colleges on the campuses that are traditionally white. And so that's all I have for you today. I look forward to any questions and comments that you might have. I saw the young lady's hand in the back. Go up first.
I just have a really strong reaction to the presentation. I thought it was great. I was a student who attended a black university before I came to Wayne State, and so I'm particularly infuriated by the logic of the argument of the Southern states, and really just hit over the head by the narrative that I got from Black people when I decided to attend a Black university, which was Black colleges are irrelevant, Black colleges don't prepare you for the real world, and the students there can't perform as well as students at traditionally white universities, so why are you even choosing to go to that school in the first place? But after looking at this presentation, it's almost like if the Supreme Court or whoever was trying to use this race-neutral argument in the first place, if Black colleges were in communities where whites had easy access, why wouldn't the logic follow that if they're just colleges, we should fund them? Like, skip all the other stuff. Okay, fine. We don't want to call them Black colleges. We just want to call them colleges and want more students to go. What is the big deal about, I know what the big deal is. I do. But I'm just saying, my comment is, what is the big deal? Why is it so doggone hard to just follow the same logic that you would follow to make Wayne State attractive to a student and make Alabama A&M attractive to a student?
Yeah, what I was able to talk more about in the book chapter that this talk is based on that I wasn't able to talk at length about here is after Brown is passed, you know, it's not like people decided, oh, I'm going to stop being racist tomorrow because Brown is passed. And so part of the Southern state strategy was to keep universities separate for as long as possible, even though, you know, you have organizations like the NAACP constantly filing lawsuits. And so part of the reason is that there is still the idea that these need to be separate spaces, that we need to protect and ensure especially that the traditionally white flagship universities are white for as long as possible. And so all the maneuvers and machinations that the Southern state undergoes is to make that happen. And if in the process we can further dilute the educational opportunities for Black students, then okay, that's not so bad. I don't mean to make it seem callous, but if you sort of like read the archives and the transcripts, especially, this is before a time when people felt the need to be like politically correct when they documented stuff. That's sort of the narrative that comes through. And so the idea that you would actually compensate Black colleges for past behaviors is a problem, because guess what? In West Virginia, we already have evidence. White students actually don't have a problem attending historically Black colleges if they're close and if they compare favorably to traditionally white colleges. And so if you are going to fully fund Black colleges in the state of Mississippi, that's a problem because we might be like fostering miscegenation or something. And so there is an entire logic and narrative about keeping white spaces white for as long as possible. And if in the process of keeping white spaces white, you dilute the power and possibilities of Black spaces, then that's
or
just...
eliminate them.
Right, then that just is what it is.
I just wanted to commend your presentation. It's really important this dialogue happen in a time like today when, you know, affirmative action policies, people have these really sort of reduced, flat arguments about why we do race neutral. This really hits it right in the face of, we never were race neutral. But two things, one, just a case sort of study of how that happened when after the Anderson case, when whites actually, well, Black schools were penalized for not admitting more white students. The case in North Carolina Central University, which has a graduate school of library and information science, I'm faculty here in library science, so it was interesting to me that they have majority white students to this day because of that back in the 1960s, and it's just, it's unfathomable. But in terms of how critical race theory worked, and I saw that in your argument, that the idea that interest conversion, so whites will only tolerate racial advancement when it's in their interest. So you saw it like over and over again, where it was like, okay, if it works for us, it's going to work. But you know, I never really heard it like that, put that way. So I commend you. And then to the audience here, as far as Wayne State is concerned, I really think we need to kind of open back up the dialogue. I mean, we have our med school is looking at, you know, accreditation issues because of the lack of Black students in med school. But in the undergrad situation, I mean, we're in the heart of, you know, Chocolate City, and we have, you know, no Black students basically, and the conversation always comes back to, oh, they're underprepared and they're not ready to handle undergraduate education. But we never, you know, look at the policies. I was on the academic senate when, you know, it was just kind of this thing that started happening, and it was like, oh, we're gonna heighten the standards. Well, who is that affecting? Like, I mean, I guess I was a new faculty. I should have stood up and said, you know, who is this actually gonna affect? We know who it's gonna affect, but it rolled through, and now we can look at it and see why our numbers are way less than they were since I've been here. So it's just great. But thank you. I appreciate this.
Were you suggesting that as a policy that the money trying to encourage people from all over to go to school, they create satellite schools, that instead they should, might not be applicable in Michigan, better fund the historically black colleges and feed the people into those schools, and that's a specific policy decision that they don't want to do that, even though that might be more financially effective? And I'm also curious if your book covers the divinity angle, and you didn't talk about it in this presentation.
I don't really focus like on divinity colleges or medical colleges. I'm looking more at the aggregate, and so what was happening at all of the colleges. And so, but going back to the funding issue. And so take a state like Maryland that has traditionally white colleges that are primarily located around like the Baltimore, DC sort of 95 corridor. And their historically black colleges tend to be located on the eastern side of the state. After the Brown ruling, what you began to see happening is that the state of Maryland began to open up satellite campuses of, say, the University of Maryland near the eastern shore to capture white students who presumably would have otherwise potentially gone to historically black college. But if nothing else, they definitely diverted funds because they created those annex colleges that could have presumably gone to historically black colleges. And so thinking about the detriment that does to historically black colleges. And it's not like a perfect corollary, but if you think about how like Michigan, University of Michigan, you know, they have like whatever that, well, no, just thinking about they have these sort of annexes of their universities now in close proximity to Wayne State. And so the state could have said, no, Wayne State is here, how about we develop some further capacity at Wayne State, and Michigan, you continue to by and large operate out of Ann Arbor and its environs. And so it's not that Wayne State can't recruit, can't continue to do its activities, but it's also the case that presumably the University of Michigan being so close now here is siphoning resources and people that otherwise might have come here. And so it's not that like the black colleges can't continue to recruit, but it's naive to think that resources aren't being siphoned away from them in that annex policy.
Can I just kind of comment on that as well? I'm an alumnus of Langston University in Oklahoma, which is a historically black college. And one of the things, so Langston came about in the late 1800s, and we have annex campuses in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And so after these campuses were opened, Oklahoma State University opened campuses directly next door to both of the campuses. And so the Board of Governors pretty much met, and they took away some of the programs that Langston offered because they followed the same Board of Governors as Oklahoma State Board of Regents. And so a number of students were lost. These annex campuses in Oklahoma City and Tulsa were very diverse, and a number of our students were lost because of the resources that were pulled from those institutions, both from like a student aspect and then faculty members as well. So that's, I think that kind of touches on that as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and so just thinking about, yes, you know, Langston can continue to do things, but you have to recognize that resources were siphoned away from the historically black college in order to make the traditionally white college in that context look more diverse, look more successful. And so that's a problem, and things didn't have to work out that way. It could have, you know, we could re-envision things working out in a way that actually advantaged black colleges.
I enjoyed the presentation as well. My question has to do with, I don't know just how essentially this is to your research project, but I was interested in your discussion about the court cases. Beginning in 1936, you stated that Maryland was the first lawsuit. So I was wondering, and then after that, you get a series of court cases that are critical towards immigration. So my question is, from your research, what changed between 1876 and 1936, this kind of the period after Reconstruction, that led to the beginning of court rulings emphasizing immigration? Because you had cases like Ida B. Wells case in the late 1880s. That was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. You also had, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 96. You had a series of court cases that were pushing for integration prior to 1936, and then leading up to the civil rights movement. So I was wondering, in your research, what changed in kind of geopolitical atmosphere within the country that led to more positive?
One of the things that changed that was beginning to become clear in the 1930s, but that was definitely clear in '54, and that the Supreme Court actually touched on, is that up until about the 1910s, 1920s, education is still by and large a private affair. And it's particularly within the South, most students aren't invested in education, black or white. But as the South became a more urban population, kids were expected to be in school, and they were by and large enrolling in public spaces, be they universities or K through 12. And so the state, what changed is the state could actually no longer pretend that education wasn't a big deal. They were highly, like the number of students who were in school, they couldn't pretend as though not offering students equal opportunities was a solution that could actually go forward, for another generation. And so one of the things that the NAACP pointed out, and that the Supreme Court actually picked up on during these series of rulings, was how critical a role the state actually played in education. And so if the state is going to play that critical role, we actually do have to pay attention to constitutional principles. Are we actually thinking about the 14th and 15th Amendment? Are we actually protecting due process and equal rights in a way? And if the state is actually going to play this prominent a role in education, then the state actually needs to fulfill its constitutional obligation. So that was the thing that changed. The number, how as society became more urban, kids were in school, whereas they hadn't been in that 1876 to say 1910, 1915 period. It's 1:30, so I think I should probably end here, but thank you all for coming, and thank you very much.